Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. We are diving into something pretty major today. We're looking at President Trump's proposed 25% tariffs on imported cars and car parts,
Mm,
and trying to figure out what the impacts would really be if these were to actually be put into place.
yeah.
We've got some interesting analysis here, excerpts from an article called Trump's Auto Tariffs, Boon or Bust for America.
Right.
And our goal today is to really, for you listening, is to understand the core arguments on each side of this issue, both for and against, and think about what the consequences could be, both for you, like your own spending power, but also for the larger U.S. economy.
For sure.
So let's get into this.
Yeah, this is a policy with the potential to really reshape a major global industry. So
Right.
taking the time to understand how it works and what the potential outcomes could be is a good investment.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's start with like the basics.
Sure.
What are these tariffs? I mean, when we talk about tariffs, what are we actually talking about?
Well, in the simplest terms, it's a proposal to put a 25% tax on all cars and car parts that are imported into the U.S.
Okay.
So, think of vehicles manufactured in Japan, Germany, or Mexico. Basically, any car or part coming in from outside the U.S. would be hit with this pretty significant extra charge.
Wow. Okay, and so the idea here, our source says, is to make American-made cars the star of the show, right?
Right.
So it's about making, those foreign-made vehicles and parts pricier so that American-made products are more competitive, and ultimately to bolster the U.S. auto industry.
Yeah, exactly. The thinking is that if those imported options become more expensive, consumers will be more likely to go for vehicles and parts that are made here in the U.S.
Yeah.
So it's a direct attempt to encourage people to buy American and hopefully revive manufacturing in this country.
Okay, so let's talk about the potential positives here.
Okay.
The what our source calls the Boon argument. What are the best case scenarios, the optimistic projections?
Well, the biggest argument in favor of the tariffs is this idea of a huge boost to the American economy. The source mentions a possible increase of something like $100 billion.
Wow.
And they project that this would come from the higher demand for vehicles that are, made in the USA.
Okay, so if more people are buying American cars, what does that mean in a practical sense?
Right.
Does that mean more jobs?
Well, that's exactly what people are hoping for.
Okay.
The idea is that with more demand for American-made vehicles, there would have to be more production in U.S. factories.
Right.
And that would probably mean hiring more workers to keep up with that production, especially in places that already have a lot of car manufacturing, like Detroit or Ohio, as our source points out.
Yeah.
It really plays into this idea of America first,
Mhm.
putting American industries and American jobs first.
So the hopeful scenario is this sort of like resurgence of manufacturing, with busy factories and lots of new jobs in the auto sector. That's the best case. That's the boon, right?
Yeah.
But, economic policies can be tricky.
Yeah. So let's talk about the potential downsides, particularly how it could affect, people listening to this right now.
Well, this is where things get a little complicated because the modern car industry is so interconnected.
Okay.
Even though the goal is to promote American-made products, the truth is that even cars made in the U.S. use parts that come from all over the world.
Right. And our source really emphasizes this. They talk about, cars aren't built in a bubble. And they use this analogy of the auto industry being like a global jigsaw puzzle.
Right.
So even if you buy a car with an American brand name on it, chances are there are parts inside that were actually made in other countries.
Exactly. And if those imported parts suddenly become 25% more expensive because of the tariffs, it's pretty much guaranteed that those higher costs are going to get passed on to the people buying the cars,
Right.
which means that the price of almost all vehicles, regardless of where they're actually assembled, could end up going up.
And we're not talking about small change here, are we?
No, not at all. I mean, the source mentions some pretty big potential price increases.
Yeah, they suggest it could be anywhere from $2,000 to $12,000 more per vehicle,
Wow.
which, for most people who are thinking about buying a new car, whether it's a truck or a family car or an SUV, that's a lot of money to add onto the price.
Oh, yeah. That could definitely make people think twice about buying a new car.
Right.
And it's not just about the sticker price, is it?
No.
I mean, the source also hints at other negative consequences that could go beyond the individual consumer.
That's true. If car companies are having to pay more for imported parts and maybe seeing fewer people buying cars because of these higher prices, they might start looking for ways to cut costs in other areas of their business.
Right.
And that could unfortunately lead to things like laying off workers or not hiring new ones,
Yeah.
which would totally contradict the whole point of trying to create more jobs in the first place. So you could end up with this situation where the potential benefits of more jobs are canceled out by job losses somewhere else in the auto industry.
So it sounds like it's kind of a risky move with some potentially big downsides for consumers and maybe even for jobs in the end.
Yeah,
And the impact might not even stop there, right?
right.
Let's talk about this idea of a ripple effect that our source mentions.
Yeah, so this refers to the possibility of other countries retaliating with their own tariffs.
Okay.
If the U.S. puts tariffs on their cars and parts, those countries could easily turn around and put tariffs on goods that are made in the U.S.
Okay.
And that could include not just American cars, but also things like agricultural products, crops and things like
Oh,
that.
I see. Yeah.
Our source uses this great analogy here. They compare it to a bar fight, lots of punches, but no clear winner.
Right.
And that really illustrates this idea of a bigger trade war where everyone ends up losing in the end. Exactly, because these retaliatory tariffs can create this kind of escalating cycle of trade barriers where
Yeah.
everyone is just adding more and more tariffs. And that leads to higher prices for businesses and consumers across all kinds of industries, not just cars. It can mess up existing global supply chains and damage trade relationships between countries in a big way.
Okay, so now let's step back a little bit, like our source suggests, and look at these potential auto tariffs in the context of all of President Trump's trade policies. This isn't really an isolated proposal, is it?
No, not at all. The proposed auto tariffs fit into a broader pattern of trade actions that were a big part of the Trump administration. The source mentions, for example, tariffs that were already put on steel, aluminum, and goods from China and Mexico.
So the overall strategy seems to be consistent, making foreign products more expensive so that companies are more likely to manufacture things here in the U.S.
Right, it's a deliberate attempt to sort of reshape global trade.
Yeah.
The idea is to use tariffs as a tool to encourage companies to make their products in the United States, with the goal of ultimately making American industry stronger. As the source puts it, it's a bold move. It's a gamble that could potentially lead to a manufacturing boom, but it also has some big risks like higher prices and even the possibility of a recession.
Okay, so when we try to put all of this together, this question of whether these auto tariffs would be a boon or a bust is a really complicated one.
Yeah,
There are strong arguments on both sides.
for sure. Those who support the tariffs really emphasize the potential for creating jobs and bringing back American manufacturing and making the U.S. more economically independent.
Yeah.
And these are really powerful arguments, especially for communities that have been hit hard by things like globalization and the decline of manufacturing jobs.
Right. And on the other hand, people who are against the tariffs point out the very real possibility of higher prices for consumers and the fact that the global car industry is so interconnected and that there's a real danger of other countries retaliating with their own tariffs, which could lead to wider economic problems.
Exactly. The long-term consequences are pretty unclear. The source makes this great comparison. They say tariffs are like planting a seed. You don't know if you'll get a bumper crop or a weed until it grows.
Oh, I like that.
Right.
Yeah.
It captures that sense of uncertainty.
Yeah.
The effects of this policy would be felt by all sorts of people, from auto workers to regular consumers to other countries that trade with the U.S.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into the potential impact of these auto tariffs, we come back to the central question that our source asks, and it's something for you listening to think about too.
Hmm?
Will these tariffs be the thing that supercharges the American economy, or will they just cause a bunch of problems? It's clear that there are lots of different viewpoints and possible outcomes, and it's not a simple issue with an easy answer.
Absolutely. It's important to understand the main arguments, both for and against these tariffs, because it helps us make sense of what's happening in the world of trade and economics.
Yeah.
And the effects of these kinds of policies go way beyond just the car industry. They can have a big impact on the economy as a whole, which affects everyone.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. This is a story that's still developing, and we'll be keeping a close eye on how things unfold and what the real-world effects of these policies might be.
For sure.
So stay tuned.